You just left a conversation, and in your head it went badly. You stumbled over a sentence. There was a pause that felt 3 years long. You said something and immediately thought, why did I say that? So now you're replaying it, editing it, cringing at it, building a whole case against yourself. Here's the part that should make you angry. Scientists have tested this exact moment, not once, across a decade of research with thousands of real conversations between real strangers. And what they found is that the version of the conversation happening in your head is almost never the version that happened in reality. You didn't have a bad conversation, you had a normal one. Your brain just told you a different story about it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why your brain does this to you. And more importantly, you're going to walk away with the 2 or 3 specific things that separate a conversation that fizzles from one that actually creates connection. Not vague advice like, be more confident. Actual, tested mechanics. Because it turns out small talk was never really about talking. It's about something much older than that. Let's start with the replay in your head. In 2018, a researcher named Erica Boothby ran an experiment at Cornell. She paired up total strangers, had them talk for a few minutes, and then asked both people the same 2 questions. How much did you like your partner, and how much do you think your partner liked you? Here's what happened almost every single time. People consistently rated how much they liked their partner higher than they guessed their partner liked them. Boothby called it the liking gap. The space between how much someone actually likes you after talking to you and how much you think they do. And this wasn't a one-off. She ran the same study 5 separate times with over 600 people in different settings, some strangers just chatting, some college roommates tracked across an entire year of living together. The gap showed up every time. In the roommate study, people underestimated how much their roommate liked them for months. It didn't close until they'd basically become close friends. Why does this happen? Because you have access to information the other person doesn't. You know every awkward pause, every sentence you second-guessed, every moment you thought, that came out weird. They don't have access to any of that. They just experienced a person who showed up, asked about their day, and paid attention to them. You're grading yourself on your internal footage. They're grading you on your actual behavior. And those 2 things are almost never the same movie. So the next time you leave a conversation feeling like it went badly, that feeling is data about your anxiety, not data about how the other person actually feels. That distinction alone changes how much small talk costs you emotionally. But here's where it gets more interesting, because liking you isn't the same as wanting to talk to you again, and that's a completely different problem. Quick reframe before we go further, because this is the part almost nobody explains, right? There's a researcher named Robin Dunbar who spent years studying primates, chimps, baboons, gorillas, and one thing he noticed is that they spend enormous amounts of time grooming each other. Not for hygiene, for bonding. Grooming is how a chimp says, "You're one of mine, I've got your back." But here's the problem early humans ran into. As our social groups got bigger, there wasn't enough time in the day to physically groom everyone we needed to stay bonded with. Dunbar's theory is that language evolved partly to solve this exact problem. It let us groom multiple people at once, with our voices instead of our hands. And when he looked at what people actually talk about most of the time, it wasn't facts or ideas. It was social information. Who's doing what, how someone's doing, what's going on with people around us. That's small talk. It's not filler before the real conversation starts. It's the modern version of a chimp picking through another chimp's fur. It's a bonding ritual that happens to use words instead of hands. Which means the goal was never to sound smart or interesting. The goal is signaling. Every time you ask someone how their weekend was, you're not really asking for a weather report on their weekend. You're saying, in a socially acceptable code, "I see you and I'm willing to spend effort on you." That's the entire function. Once you see it that way, the pressure to be clever kind of evaporates because cleverness was never the point. Okay, so if the function of small talk is connection, not content, then the real question becomes, what actually creates that felt sense of connection during a conversation? And that's where it gets uncomfortable, because most of us are doing the opposite of what works. There's one study coming up that measured this almost like a lab experiment on strangers, and the size of the effect is honestly kind of embarrassing for how simple the fix is. Stick around, because this next part is the one thing in this video that will change tonight's conversation, not just your theory of conversation. In 2022, researchers Michael Kardas, Amit Kumar, and Nicholas Epley ran a study where they took strangers and split them into 2 groups. One group had a typical, safe conversation, surface level stuff. The other group was assigned to go deeper than usual, sharing something more personal, more meaningful, right from the start with someone they just met. Before the conversation, almost everyone predicted the deep version would feel awkward and uncomfortable. That's the intuition basically all of us share, which is exactly why we default to weather and traffic with strangers. We're protecting ourselves from a discomfort we assume is coming. But after the conversation actually happened, the people in the deep talk group reported it felt significantly better than the small talk group predicted. More enjoyable, more connecting, more meaningful. The gap between how awkward people expected it to feel and how it actually felt was enormous. People are consistently, dramatically wrong about how uncomfortable real connection will be. We're all bracing for a hit that almost never lands. Here's the practical version of that finding. The fastest way to make small talk stop feeling small is to go one notch deeper than feels natural. Not tell a stranger your deepest trauma, deep. Just instead of how's work, try what's actually been stressful about work lately. Instead of good weekend, try what was the best part of it. You're not changing the topic. You're changing the altitude of the same topic. And the research says people consistently underestimate how much that lands. There's a second piece to this, and it comes from a completely different study. This one about first dates. Researchers looked at what separated people who got asked on a second date from people who didn't, and the single strongest predictor wasn't how funny someone was or how much they talked about themselves. It was how many follow-up questions they asked. People who asked more follow-ups were seen as more caring, more interesting, and were far more likely to be asked out again. Not original questions, follow-ups. Wait, why did you decide to do that? That's it. That's most of the skill. Put those two findings together and you get the actual formula. Ask one level deeper than feels comfortable and follow up on what they say instead of waiting for your turn to talk. That's not a personality transplant. That's two habits. One more piece, because this is the part that quietly ruins conversations for a lot of people. Not the middle of it, the end of it. Researchers at Harvard analyzed over 900 real conversations and asked both people afterward, was there a point where you wanted this to end? Then they compared it to when their partner wanted it to end. If conversations were coordinated the way we assume they are, both people would land near the same moment. They didn't. In fact, both people wanted the conversation to end at the same time in only about 2% of cases. Most conversations either dragged on past when one person was ready to go or cut off before someone actually wanted to stop. And almost nobody could accurately guess what their partner wanted. They just assumed the other person felt roughly the way they did. This matters because a huge amount of "that was awkward" isn't about anything you said. It's about not knowing how to leave, or worrying you left too soon, or staying 5 minutes too long out of politeness and souring the whole thing in your memory. Once you know that literally nobody is good at this, that it's not a skill gap, it's a structural blind spot every human has, you can stop punishing yourself for it. A short, warm exit like, "I've got to head out, but I really enjoyed this," lands better almost every time than the long, awkward fade you're probably defaulting to now. So here's the actual shape of what you learned today. You think people like you less than they do. You think depth is riskier than it is. You think you're bad at endings when really everyone is. None of that was ever about your personality. It was about a set of predictable, well-documented blind spots that every human carries into every conversation. Introvert or not. Small talk was never a test you were failing. It's an old, quiet ritual for saying, "I see you," that happens to be dressed up in small sentences about the weather. You already know how to do it. You've been doing it your whole life. The only thing standing between you and feeling less exhausted by it is knowing which parts of your discomfort are real and which parts are just your brain telling you a story that isn't true.